If you want to understand how power works in the world today, you have to start by stepping away from the arguments that you see on television or on social media. Political debates often sound like they're about ideology, capitalism versus socialism, left versus right, democracy versus authoritarianism. When you look closely at how the global system actually operates, those debates are often only the surface. The deeper layer is about control over resources, logistics corridors, and populations. Countries that control the routes where the goods travel, where the minerals used in modern technology or the workforce that powers industries tend to have far more influence than countries that only have strong political messaging. The global system works step by step. First, natural resources are extracted somewhere in the world. Then they will move through transportation systems like ports, railways, pipelines, or shipping lanes. After that, factories process those materials into products. And finally, those products are sold to consumers through international trade networks. Every step or stage of that process requires infrastructure and cooperations between governments, companies, and financial institutions. The countries that design, finance, or control those stages gain long term influence. That influence does not come from speeches or ideological persuasion. It comes from logistics, comes from contracts and physical control of the systems that move resources across the planet. Once you start observing geopolitics through that lens, global events begin to make a little more sense. Decisions about ports, railways, mineral deposits, and supply chains often shape international relationships more than political rhetoric ever will. So stop believing the idea that the fight is between left and right, or communism versus capitalism, or that the clownery that happens in parliament is aimed at the things that matter most to you. We have moved past that. The real question now is who owns what? Who owns the shipping routes? Who owns the supply chains, the minerals, and whether those resources are being undersold? That is what tells you who actually has power and who only thinks that they do. Once you look at global systems this way, patterns appear very quickly. Take the example of rare earth minerals. These minerals are used in electronics, renewable energy systems, electric vehicles, and military equipment. A large portion of the world's rare earth processing happens in China. That doesn't mean China controls every rare earth mine, but it does mean many industries depend on Chinese processing facilities to turn raw materials into usable components. And this creates leverage for China. When a country controls a critical step in the supply chain, it gains negotiating power over industries and governments that rely on that step. That is why the United States and the European Union have spent the past few years trying to diversify their supply chains too. They want processing capacity in more locations so that a single country does not hold too much influence over key technologies. You will see that this is not an ideological competition. It's structural competition over who controls the machinery of the global economy. Logistics corridors tell the same story. Global trade moves mostly by sea, and a handful of narrow passages determine how quickly goods travel between continents. One example is the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Another is the Strait of Hormuz, through which a large portion of the world's oil supply travels. There is also the Panama Canal, which allows ships to move between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without sailing around South America. So these corridors are not just geographical features, they are pressure points in the global economy. When something disrupts them, like we're seeing now with the Strait of Hormuz, the effects ripple through supply chains immediately. The world saw this clearly in 2021 when the container ship Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal for several days. Billions of dollars in trade were delayed and shipping schedules across the world were thrown off. That incident showed how fragile and interconnected the logistics system is. Governments study these vulnerabilities carefully because controlling or protecting these routes become a matter of national security. A country that can safeguard or influence key trade corridors gains economic stability and strategic leverage. And that is why modern geopolitics increasingly revolves around infrastructure and ports and pipelines and shipping routes rather than purely ideological alliances. Once you begin looking at the world through infrastructure and resources, another factor becomes impossible to ignore: demographics. Population size and age structure quietly shape economic power over long periods of time. Countries with large and growing populations tend to have expanding labor forces and larger domestic markets and a steady supply of workers for industries and militaries. Countries with shrinking or aging populations face the opposite problem. Their workforce becomes smaller, their social systems become more expensive to maintain, and their long term economic momentum slows down. This demographic shift is becoming one of the biggest structural forces in global governance. According to projections from the United Nations, much of the world's population growth over the next several decades will occur in parts of Southern Africa and South Asia. Meanwhile, countries like Japan and several states in Europe are experiencing rapid population aging and in some cases population decline. That shift changes how companies invest, how supply chains develop, and where infrastructure gets built. Businesses look for places where future workers and consumers exist. Governments look for partners where markets are expanding. A young population means more people are entering the workforce, more demand for housing, for technology, for potential innovations. It also means that governments must build infrastructure quickly enough to support that growth. So, roads, power systems, ports, and digital networks become urgent priorities. From a security perspective, demographics also matter because a large young population can influence military recruitment and national resilience. When global investors and governments and institutions study future economic maps, they increasingly see Africa not only as a resource base, but also as one of the largest emerging demographic centers in the global system. This demographic reality is one reason large infrastructure initiatives are expanding across developing regions. Instead of competing only through ideology, major powers now compete by building physical networks that shape trade patterns for decades. One well known example is the Belt and Road Initiative launched by China. The initiative focuses on financing and constructing ports, railways, highways, and energy pipelines across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. On the surface, these projects are about development and connectivity, but from a systems perspective, they also create long term logistical relationships. When a country builds a railway or port in another country, it often gains influence over how goods move through that network, right? Financing arrangements can also create obligations that shape political decisions for years to come. At the same time, other players are responding to this infrastructure competition. The United States, the European Union, and partners such as Japan have begun supporting alternative infrastructure funding initiatives designed to provide additional options for developing economies. From the outside, this may look like development assistance or investment diplomacy, but underneath it is a strategic competition over who helps build the roads, the power systems, and ports that future supply chains are going to rely on. Whoever helps design and finance those systems often shapes how trade flows through them. So for countries in Africa, this creates both opportunity and risk. Infrastructure investment can accelerate development and expand trade, but poorly structured agreements can lock in countries into long term obligations that limit their economic flexibility. That is why careful negotiation and transparent governance becomes essential when accepting large infrastructure deals. Yes, I'm looking at the France one. For African governments in particular, the strategic challenge is learning how to recognize leverage before giving it away. Many countries on the continent possess resources that are becoming more important in modern industries. Minerals used in batteries, electronics, and renewable energy technologies are increasingly concentrated in parts of Africa. Agricultural land and renewable energy potential also adds to the continent's strategic importance. Combine that with demographic growth. These assets create a powerful position inside the global system, but leverage only exists if it is managed carefully. If resources are exported cheaply without local processing, most of the economic value leaves the country where the resources are extracted. If infrastructure agreements are poorly negotiated, the systems built to transport resources may benefit external partners more than local economies. This is why investment manipulation is a risk that leaders need to watch closely. Foreign investors may offer quick funding for mines, ports, energy projects, but the details inside those contracts determine who ultimately controls the long term value of those assets. Governance institutions therefore play a crucial role right now. Transparent procurement systems and independent regulatory bodies and strong negotiation teams need to pull up their socks to make sure that infrastructure development actually strengthens national sovereignty rather than weakening it. As the global systems evolve, the countries that gain the most influence will not necessarily be the ones making the loudest ideological arguments. The countries that gain influence right now will be the ones that quietly secure the resources, the ones that are building logistics networks and managing demographic momentum that keeps economies expanding. And over time, those structural advantages accumulate into real power inside the global system.